Well, as we all know, in every civilized country, what comes after lunch is the siesta. So, golden dreams. By the way, this was not my topic of choice. It was chosen for me. But the more I read, the more interesting it became. So what I am going to be doing is contrasting two types of utopias. The first one rests on a realist ontology, and it consists in constructing models of alternative ways of living on the basis of some assumed set of resources, which can be very, very different, of course, and thereby counterbalancing actualism, I'll define that in a second, and informing hope. Now, hope is very central to utopian thinking. Nearly all of Ernest Bloch's books used the word hope in the title, and certainly in the contents. I will be dealing much more with Roy Bhaskar as the founder of critical realism. Now, in this view, the concrete utopia pinpoints the real but not actualized possibilities inherent in a situation. And because it pinpoints how something can be different, it inspires as he puts it, grounded hope to inform emancipatory praxis. So real here means realizable. It designates possibilities, and I'll give you some examples in a minute. Possibilities that can be actualized given particular constraints. And it's this realizability that distinguishes real possibilities from fantasies and wish fulfillments. Now, in contrast, we have real utopias. I'm sorry that the language chosen by the authors is confusing. This is Eric Olin Wright's work based on the American Real Utopias project. And his leitmotif is that the very diversity of current economies, what he calls the diverse economy, what you this morning were calling hybrids or hybridity, now combines the market, state, and civil society. So there's nothing much original here yet. His utopia offers a range of partial alternatives that derive from extrapolating from existing institutions. And in it, because he is an unapologetic socialist, he argues that capitalism becomes less hegemonic and the mixed economy becomes more pro-social. So it's a sort of, I call it a pudding recipe. You stir the three and you get something different from all three, which is a hybrid, but which is preferable to any of the three taken in isolation. So actualism is the view that what actually exists now is the basis from which one projects what could exist if one acted in the right way collectively in the future, but it excludes the possible from reality. He actually says this is just a heuristic device for whipping up opposition to the existing economy. So in this Real Utopias project, it links up very, very closely indeed with the objective of linking the logic of markets i.e. the exchange of equivalents, states, that is, the redistribution of society's scarce resources, mainly through taxation, and civil society and its principle of reciprocity. So, since many of you said this morning that these three were close to the goal of Pope Benedict in Caritas in Veritate, that's why I took up this particular author, because he is an economist and seems to have almost exactly the same objectives in mind. In fact, this is point 5 on the overhead, in fact, it turns out to be praise for the mixed economy, which is hardly original, which he himself calls hybridity between the three components, and whose balance, and this is the utopian bit, can become more pro-social if we extrapolate from what already exists. It's capable, in other words, of improvement. Now, let's have a look at some test cases of real macro social problems and how, I will argue, these possibilities are all capable of realization on the concrete utopian model, whereas in terms of Eric Wright's real utopias, actually existing economic relations intensify human liabilities. So the examples I picked are ones that we have discussed in this academy many times. First, there exist the resources to feed the world's population. The problem is one of distribution. It's not one of brute scarcity of foodstuffs. It's something Stefano I've heard argue many a time. Second, we have the global capacity to decelerate climate change, if not to reverse it completely or completely eliminate it. And in the pursuit of this, and since the Paris Agreement of 2015, we have got some unexpected cooperative allies in this pursuit of decelerating, if not eliminating, climate change. China, and oddly enough, the motor manufacturers, who are now so ahead of the game that they've invested too much in the prototypes of non-petrol fueled vehicles, that unlike President Trump, they don't want to renege on the Paris Accord. Third, decent work, a term increasingly used by the ILO and the United Nations. Decent work for all could be realized, given some foresight and given the use of robotics creatively, accompanied by appropriate retraining schemes. And fourth, because I don't really want to argue about these test cases, I think they are as they are. Fourth, asylum seekers, even ones in growing numbers, could and can be accommodated. Now, I would argue, but this is a matter of my personal values, which will be shared by quite a number of people here, that these are 4 goals that we would like to achieve, that are good for humanity for us to achieve. So what is actually stopping us from achieving them? After all, we passed the Paris Agreement, we got clause 8.7 inserted into the Sustainable Development Goals as redesignated in 2015, and it looked as though we were on the way towards a better world. Not a perfect world, but a better world. Well, in 20,000, I wrote a book called Being Human, and this diagram was actually born in that book. It distinguishes, and I'm sorry, it seems to come up very small on the screen, but it distinguishes between the natural order, the practical order, and the social order. And I think this is very important to do because it's the relations, the relationality between these three orders that makes for the problems. I think, as I said this morning, I don't like just pulling out the market, the state, and civil society as if they were not embedded in something much bigger called the world. They are embedded in the world, and the world has some, the world as we make it, not as it was created, the world has some pretty negative effects upon these three pieces. So if we look at the relations between the natural and the practical orders, nature and the practical order just stands for what used to be called material culture, the techniques by which we do things. Climate change, you could say, signaled the millennial switch from man's mastery over nature to its precise opposite. That is, the repercussions of destructive human interventions in nature upon man and woman. I'm just using the terminology of the time with male embracing female, much as it's to be regretted. Now, why is this the case? Mainly because competition is inherent in capitalist production. I've called it the imperative of growth, but I suspect I have stolen that from Joseph Schumpeter. In other words, capitalism, as Marx himself said, is only healthy when it is growing. Growth and profit both increase by shifting manufacturing to the extractive peripheries. In other words, when we used to talk about the multinationals only 30 years ago, 35 years ago, we were talking about shifting manufacturing to countries where wages were lower, where restrictions on toxic waste were non-existent, and in some cases still are, and where they represented a huge potential future consumer market. And that's one of the interesting things you can do as a sort of cross between a sociologist and an economist. It's to track demographically the relationship. Again, it's not a causal one, it's just a correlation. Track the relationship between patterns of investment in different places and the percentage of the population that is under 25 years old. The correlation is remarkably strong. To a realist, that calls for some explanation. And I think the explanation is pretty obvious there. But it would be interesting to do a little ethnography of how corporate decisions are made about relocation of new investment, new plants, etc., etc. And secondly, this growth imperative is something that's very, very questionable. Pascal said, infinite growth is environmentally unsustainable, and that degrowth is what was needed. Now, that seems to me a very ambitious project, but one very, very worth undertaking. But maybe you know, Stefano, of some examples of people studying degrowth. I'm not an economist. The trouble is that the growth imperative is inherent in capitalist competition. Schumpeter called it creative destruction, which he regarded as being intrinsic to capitalism in order to, quote, fuel its insatiable appetite for growth. Now, if we move on that, I don't know whether I can get it back there and back again. Yes, there we had it for a minute. If we move to this diagram and look at the relationship between the practical order in the middle and the social order on the extreme right-hand side, we find different contradictions there. There is a negative relationship, again, between the imperative for growth and the increasing relational harm experienced in the social order and experienced as the decline in social integration. The most blatant indicators of this are actually found not in Caritas in Veritate, but in the homilies of Pope Francis. And if you put them together, and I'm not sure he would object to this, on the other hand, I don't know, the most blatant indicators are, to our Pope, the growth of what he calls disposable people. What does he mean by this? He means the retired, he means unskilled youth, he means routine workers replaced by robots, and probably other categories. These are just ones that I've come across in unsystematically reading some of his homilies. What else makes for disposable people? Well, some of the things, again, that were discussed this morning. Nationalist anti-immigration or populist anti-immigration, they are virtually interchangeable, throughout most of Europe. Certainly in the governments of Hungary, Poland, Austria, very, very recently, and growth of strong parties that threaten to be challengers to taking office in both France with the Front Populaire and in Great Britain with UKIP, United Nations Independence Party, and in the Netherlands, and even in the country with the most courageous leader in Europe over the last 10 years, in Germany, Angela Merkel, who has been, I think, the best going, most humanitarian going, lost, she kept her position, but she lost support. And in losing support, she modified the open door policy in Germany and the allocation policy used in Germany to give different Länder a percentage of migrants and asylum seekers in proportion to their numbers. That's one thing. The other side of the contradiction between the practical and the social orders is that social self-worth, this is the relational side on the right, consists in collaborating with capitalist commodification. And you can see this as witnessed in retail spending patterns, which in most European Union countries remain buoyant despite the fact that they were based upon people's growing indebtedness. So they will push their credit card limits, for example, up to the limit in order to keep spending, because their self-worth depended upon the consumer durables that they acquired, or non-consumer durables such as jewelry, which apparently has not fallen off in sales. Now, again, in these two cases, we are dealing with competition rather than cooperation or collaboration. And this leads me towards the end. What are the inadequacies of actualism, of real utopianism? Well, real utopianism rests upon current practices and extrapolating from them. I've already said that, I'm just repeating it. It is, in short, presentist. It extrapolates from the present. Now, this, I believe, is a fundamental error because the economy itself, throughout the world, is increasingly morphogenetic, subject to intense change in mode, means, etc., of production. Because it's presentist and just based on extrapolation, there's a strong tendency for them to ignore the fact that the vested interests that, let's say, a family acquired in the past, let's say in the grandfather's generation, is carried forward through the parents to the children and constitutes vested interests in keeping the structure of social stratification exactly that way, if they benefit from it. If they are merely doing what Bourdieu describes, reproducing inequalities over the generations, then they are disadvantaged by that distribution of socially scarce resources, and this precipitates conflict between them. So again, we have a promotion of contestation, not cooperation. But civil society is there to the rescue. It's like a cowboy movie. We are all part, we are told by some economists, such as Eric Wright, such as Dave Eldavas, that the gift economy is here. Now, what do they mean by it's here? They mean that if you sweep together a huge variety of gift practices, such as shopping, cooking meals, housework, voluntary activities, charitable work, etc., metrics show that this sector is bigger, and therefore it seems capitalism is not hegemonic. It's already on the run. That's why it's a good thing to go on and extrapolate from these gift economy activities. But let's just pause for 1 second. These activities, such as housework and cooking, are not alternatives to capitalism. They're not even in contestation with capitalism. Capitalism needs them in order to reproduce its labor force. And indeed, instead of it being part of the gift economy, if you take a country like Great Britain, which is the only one I had a chance to look up, much of these activities are for self-maintenance, cooking meals for yourself alone at home, because the majority of households already in Great Britain are made up of a single occupant. So you're not doing a relational good, except if you want to put it in an abstruse sense, by saving your children from having to look after you, if they would. You can't assume that that's the case. So it seems to me, in conclusion, that civil society is being seen here in real utopianism as fostering improvement. It's reformist, it's gradualist, because it's claiming, as I said this morning, that gifts are conferred by the likes of Google, YouTube, Facebook. They're gifts because there is free access to their services. Any of you not on them could sign up now without getting your credit card out. So it looks as though, well, it does to Olin Wright, it looks as though capitalism is moderating because profit and gift are morphing towards one another. As I said this morning, this is the gift as poison, because recipients are digitally wooed by this free gift and then cold-bloodedly exploited. But as an argument, it's not even persuasive, because initiatives in the voluntary sector are very often, as Habermas pointed out, colonized by the powerful. Food banks are a great example here. In, I think it was 2008, Pierpaolo, that we organized that meeting where Giorgio Vitalini was present and talked about the start of the food bank in Italy. And he told us something amazing, that when he went round with a van to the first shops that sold sandwiches, he was surprised to find that these capitalist owners didn't enjoy the idea that at midnight, when the date stamp expired, they could all go into the bin, into the trash can. Instead, they went into the van to feed the people sleeping on the streets. But the food banks have been used monstrously and ideologically during the post-2008 period. They have reduced the state's outlay on welfare benefits and allowed the rolling back of the welfare state, precisely at the time when austerity measures and quantitative easing was in force, but enabled prime ministers like David Cameron in Britain to call workers who used the food banks work shy. Secondly, charitable initiatives are not a united oppositional front to capitalism, because in fact they succumb to the logic of competition. You can see this very clearly if you rank in terms of size, meaning turnover, the main charities working in any country, because they advertise their lower overhead costs of some of them in order to attract people, donors, to think, these are good managers. It's in good hands. They're not wasting it on their own lunches or premises or whatever it might be. And they do things like, just like enterprises do, gaining gaining celebrity endorsement, employing professional lobbyists. In other words, they are just following corporate struggles rather than, in any sense, heralding a real utopia. So, very last words. You can see why this is attractive. The approach is reassuring. Matters can be fixed. Capitalism can be tamed and gentled. And there are examples, some of which I've told you I don't find convincing, that are not based on the exchange of equivalents or upon commodification. And most of us, although we may not know it, are already in the gift economy. So the bottom line is actualism actually works. And it doesn't rely upon the leftist mantra of once capitalism has been demolished. But the real problem is zero-sum competition in terms of a variety of currencies. And that's the real enemy that underlies the contradictions between the three orders of natural reality. I'm sorry, I have to stop there.